Alrighty, good evening. Welcome to Nycos. I'm Jonathan Albin, and I'm your host for the Game Master Soapbox. It is a roughly less than an hour long overview of topics that I have found particularly useful as a game master, and I want to show them, and we will include our usual rant near the end. So, we're going to begin with ambiance. And when you are playing a role play game, ambiance is usually kind of important. In other words, if you are not developing the story, the feel of the story, the plot and theme of the game session, you are leaving excitement and fun off the table. So let me go through some mechanisms. Ambiance is a nuance. In other words, players don't often come to the table already established in that ambiance. So your narration, especially if you are beginning a new series of adventures that are specifically based on that theme, then you kind of almost need to have mechanisms in place to do so. Get rid of that extra ambient sound. Alrighty. So, the way in which you establish ambiance is manifold. There are a lot of different ways you could do it. One way is through costuming. Not something that I necessarily do on a regular basis, but occasionally I'll put on a specific type of hat or a scarf or a sash or something, or even I've got stylistic clothing from Ren Fair and things like that that I'll put on to amplify the effect of the ambiance of the game session. By doing this, by setting up and preloading an emotional state, you provide an opportunity for your characters to synchronize with the story that you have planned out for them. Additionally, vocabulary is important. If you are going to be telling a story about pirates, then you need to definitely know the bow from the aft, the starboard from the port. You need to know terminology and utilize words that invoke that status. So instead of describing things as to the left or right, instead you go with the port or starboard, forward, aft, larboard. You know the lingo, the more terms that you're able to input into your story at the beginning, you make the players be excited about it because they are visually and now audially being moved into that or transported into that place of the game session. This can be done in a basically any genre. So if you are going for a Tolkienian aspect, you want there to be sweeping descriptions, then you do that. You take the extra couple of moments to talk about the rising mountains that are daunting in the distance, the rumble of thunder across the range, the echoing sound of battle somewhere beyond a barrier. These all give you the opportunity to bring that emotional charge into the game session and make the players become truly immersed in the adventure. Ambiance can also be a matter of lighting. I don't always do it, but occasionally I will use candles or artificial light that flickers to create the ambiance of a fireside discussion or whatever. And by adding even just a change in lighting that fluctuates, you give an uncertainty and a mystery to the engagement, the play of the situation. The words that you use to describe things can be rife with ambiance. If you were telling a story about vampires, of course, then you're going to use words like foreboding, dangerous, and mysterious, and the even the tone that you use when you are doing your demonstrations and discussions are important because these add this level of ambiance to the game. And the reason to do this is that role playing is an experience. You, as the game master, and your players individually are all part of a joined experience. And since, in my case, I generally run most of my games within the theater of the mind, I don't depend on miniatures necessary to tell a story. I instead use descriptions and narrative relativism and other mechanisms within the ambiance of the story to enhance the mystery and the wonder and charm. For example, it's one thing to say, what did you roll in the dice? Okay, you hit, you missed, deal your damage. If, on the other hand, you describe the attempted attack and you describe how the fur of the animal seems to have almost mystically turned the blade aside, you create terror and worry that the monster might be more than what they expect. And these terms, especially if you utilize a just undisclosed die rolling mechanism, there have been times when I have actually, the players give me their modifiers, then I roll the dice and don't reveal it and give them the response. And of course, if they challenge it, then I show the dice. But generally speaking, I utilize that kind of a methodology so that the players, while they do know their character and they know their capabilities, they don't know what the actual values of the dice are, and therefore they can more viscerally experience the game session. Ambiance can also be a matter of tenor, so the volume and the speech pattern and the speed at which you present critical, dangerous information changes the way a person reacts to that information. If you are in a hurry and it's exciting and thrilling, sure, maybe increase your tempo, increase your presentation. But if it's supposed to be a scary or terrifying situation, then slowing the speech and changing your focus to specifically draw attention to that object sitting on the table. It seems to be almost moving of its own accord. You create the desire for the players to want to discover what those mysteries are actually coming from, and where did those emotions arrive. And when you are able to do that, you create a more exciting and more enjoyable play experience. Of course, converse to that, we're going to talk a bit about realism versus the imaginary. I can't tell you how many times when I've been in a play session, I've described something and a player looks up and raises his hands and says, "Hey, this isn't real to me. There's no realism. I don't know how this could have happened because this isn't at all what we intended." Blah blah blah. And they claim to want realism in their role play games. And the challenge with that is that if you gave them realism, then 99.99% of the time they would be doing mundane things, having to roll dice for inane reasons, like whether or not they cooked their steak properly. There's all kinds of things that can be useless that are real, and yet there are some things that are imaginary that are way more valuable. So the concept of a person walking into a room exuding an air of mystery and danger is far more useful in roleplay games than the actual manifest physical description of the being. So utilizing the landscape of imagination, you're able to increase the player appreciation of what's going on. Now, obviously, in many cases, this is not necessary, and it can actually be a time waster if you are doing narrative descriptions of which the players obviously aren't paying attention. It's wasting good game time. So there are balancing places, but the idea of requiring a game to be realistic means that you're doing things in mundane terms that just actually tentatively feel abstractly wrong. So this need or desire for realism can be quelled or downplayed when you exert some of it into a game session, because soon the players will say, okay, I don't need to determine whether or not I've got to spend an hour repairing my arrows, or whether I've got to spend an extra half an hour looking for the one arrow that got lost. Let's forego that mundane, boring part of it and just get on with the adventure. Because what players come for, the reason why you sit at the table, is for those moments of excitement and indecision and concern about the outcome. And that exists wholly in the mental state of the player. And so, therefore, by invoking things that are perhaps of imagination, you are putting in the very parts that will make the encounter memorable. When you are dealing with a game session, you want obviously to have great games experiences, both from yourself and from the players. You want the communication, the throughput of information to be enjoyable. And so one of the best ways to do that is find ways to reward players for their good performances, their honorable actions, their appropriate role play. And one of the ways you can do that is something that I began doing some time ago. Matter of fact, probably in my third or fourth year, which would be like 45 years ago. But the concept of the blessing point. And I utilize a BP process, or a blessing point process, wherein appropriate play, clever repartee, ingenuity are all rewarded with these blessing points. And the blessing points are arbitrary, perhaps, mechanisms whereby the player can modify his agency within the game, either increasing his chance of succeeding or even erasing a simply a poor die roll. And by having these blessing points to be burned off in this fashion, you give them the fuel to constantly be striving to get to their objectives, but you're also giving them the mechanism whereby they have more agency, they have more involvement in the story, because they're the ones who not only created the blessing point in the first place and now have it to use, but now the use of it can mitigate the random weird factors that happen that can otherwise ruin a game session. So find ways to reward great gameplay. Some other methodologies for doing so would be recognition or acknowledgement. For a while, I had a player of the week competition in my games groups, where the players would all submit a name of someone other than themselves for this elevation, but they had to explain what it was that they saw that was particularly good. And maybe it was something that you completely overlooked. I had a situation where a player had actually been sacrificial in the things that he had given to other players, and I didn't realize that it put them into danger, and therefore it was a great role play opportunity that they took advantage of, but I didn't see it. So using the player launched initiative of Player of the Week, then I got some feedback as far as what was going on in the game that other players were getting, and that is also a very positive way of rewarding great gameplay. Ultimately, the best thing you can do after a rewarding great game situation is to call it out. Whether you acknowledge the player immediately on the scene and say, that was amazing, I really appreciate that, here's your BP. Or if you say, okay, we're at the end of the session, I want to call out something that happened tonight that I think was really amazing, and you're ask for the applause of the group for that individual. These are all ways you start to reward great players for their actions, and the more you do so, the more those great players will rise to the occasion and provide you with their necessary part of the engagement to make it really an amazing game session. when you are a game master and you're going to launch a new story with new players, particularly if they are players you haven't sat at a table with before, it's kind of important to hold a session 0. Now, I'm going to mention it later, so I'm going to do a shameless plug a little bit later, but at this point in the video, there's going to be a card that's going to come up. And over far enough to get the arrow. But I'm going to put a note here about how to get to the session 0 videos. And these are the long form Nycos story bits that add to an understanding of how a species or a character archetype or a character option can be pointed out. And by doing it in the long form, you're going to be able to get pieces from all of Nycos. But the main thing is that when you are doing a session 0, you want to focus on what the players are expecting or want to get from the game session, as well as what you would like to portray. So, for example, if I go to talk to a new group and they say, well, we're fascinated with, for example, Egyptian culture, and we'd like to do an adventure that has a kind of an Egyptian theme, then if I had in my head that I was going to be running, say, a Viking adventure, but what they're asking for is Egyptian, now I need to reconsider and reposition the story themes that I have so that they either fit, such as a Viking who discovers Egyptian relics, or conversely, maybe change my mechanism so that the game I'm playing deals with the barbarians, if you will, of the Egyptian era, and so therefore feed into what they're wanting to achieve. So the session 0 is a two-way communication instead of just a unidirectional pontification of what's coming up in the game. Pardon me. The other benefit of a session 0 is it can overcome many of the problems that can rise in a game. For example, if the players make it clear that what they're looking for is a exploratory migrant adventure, but you had in your head you were going to be running a local storyline, continuous story. Now you have to reposition what your thinking was, as well as modify your story arc to include the others. So if they don't want to travel, and you've built a travel storyline, then you have to each week come up with a necessity for them to go from point A to point B. If, on the other hand, you've built a story that's a wide-ranging, long tail arc, but they want to stay home, you can also choose to reposition the story pieces that you want to tell so they are localized. And so the realization that the fantasy world is in flux and that you as the storyteller can modify the story in either direction is really useful when you are utilizing the session 0 to get at the meat of the situation. And the session 0 has a final aspect that you can share with the players, unique information that only apply to the session or the group of sessions that you're going to run, so that they have an idea of what the boundaries are. And this is important when it comes to the maintenance of the story as intended versus what the players might develop over time. That doesn't mean you can't choose to alter course after you begin, but the point is that you need to be as true as possible as you can be to what the players were looking for in their initial assessment of your adventure. And for example, my adventures tend to be a decent mix of puzzles and mysteries with martial combat. Other systems perhaps are considerably bigger on the martial combat and very little on the puzzles. And knowing what your players are expecting, you have a better chance of giving them the mechanism to make the world what they want it to be. So at this point, I'm going to tell a bit of a story that happened in the third iteration. This would have been close to 25 years ago or so. And we were exploring an artifact laden area that had been used in a previous iteration. And the players included a rather mischievous gnome who his personal thing was to create fiction and drag his friends along in that fiction for as long as he could before he had to admit that no, it was all made up and the actual truth was something completely different. Well, in this case, they had discovered a book, and the book was written in a foreign language, and the gnome decided to claim to be able to read the language. And of course, he didn't. In fact, he didn't even know what the language was, but he, of course, told them that he was an expert at it and that he would read the book. And so for the next few sessions, he would give prognostications based on what he had read in the book. Now, he didn't know that I was going to play into that. So each time he would make these prophecies, it was totally his intent for that condition to never happen. But as I've done in other videos, I talk about the fact that prophecy is something that you can actually modify by making open-ended. Well, each time he would make a prophecy, something would happen shortly thereafter that sort of fit into the narrative. What this actually did is cause the player to be concerned that the book was actually reading his mind and led a completely different course than what he intended, to the point where he never did tell them that he didn't understand the words. And that library is actually, that book has actually been deposited into the archives of the Nikos library mechanism, and there's a lot more I could go into in there, but the idea is that that book still exists in the libraries, having never been translated or never understood, and is still potentially there for new characters in the modern iteration to discover and perhaps decode, and therefore kind of in the latter term get a bit of a charge as they know something that an earlier games group didn't discover. Okay, so when you talk about having an adult theme in a game, this can conjure all kinds of mental images. When we talk about adult themes, are we talking about sensuality, sexuality? Are we talking about violence and ramifications? Are we talking about redemptive arcs versus wish fulfillment? In a game that is fundamentally theater of the mind, a lot of situations can be handled best by utilizing the research model of, why can't I remember his name? There's a famous musician who said that you play the spaces, play the pauses as much as you play the notes. So you're playing the parts that are in between. In a theater of the mind, it is often best to create the tension desired by suggesting the mature theme, but then play off of it by leaving out critical parts or simply smiling and grinning about a specific thing that the players said they wanted to have accomplished, and kind of give a wink and a nod and a finger to the side of your nose as you go ahead and let them create the pieces you never say. This is much more effective than trying to force into their memories or their mind the graphic details that could have happened. And this allows, therefore, they as players to ruminate upon what they perceived and then feed back to you in game responses to what they think you meant to say. And this also helps you avoid the darker themes without taking away from the player's enjoyment of the game. I'm not a person that goes into graphic detail of situations within game. That's not my style. So what I will do instead is suggest or hint at something, grin my little grin, wink at the player out of the corner of my eye, and let them create the faces. What's really fascinating is that later those players, when describing, will go into the graphic details because they've invented it in their head and filled those spaces with what they perceive to have happened, and therefore you get off the hook, but they also give you credit for having created that intense experience because you didn't do all of the creation. You let them do it inside their own brains. And that's important for handling these mature themes because there's no point in upsetting or angering anybody at the table by going into graphic details when you don't need to. All right, so we're going to go to the rant now. And we talked a little bit about it earlier, and this is going to be a more specific angle on that, but I want to give the time to come around the even minute, so when I start, I keep myself to my self-imposed limits. All right, so now we're talking about the concept of players who want to bring the real into the fantasy, and I am not talking about somebody who wants to track how many arrows they have left in their quiver or how many food rations they have left or that kind of thing. What I'm referring to is when they have, for example, an animosity against a person that's at the table and they bring that emotional condition, that emotional baggage into the games group in character, and then they show or demonstrate that animosity in game that's not warranted by the evidence in the game itself. This has been a burden countless times, and it's natural. Players come to the table wanting to shrug off the difficult things that are going on in their life. I have had friends who lost their job and then they come to the games group and they think that they're going to be perfectly fine when there's a burden on their heart about their adequacy or not understanding why the employer ceased using them or whatever. And we have to find ways to dissociate those functions. So when somebody brings the real to the table, they spoil the environment for everyone. They make it difficult. And so it's important to find out what is going on with them in advance of the session, perhaps try to counter it, or if not, at least get them to identify that it is that they're responding to, and therefore they can handle it in a more healthy fashion. Now, you don't have to be a psychologist. Most game masters aren't psychologists or psychiatrists. You don't have to psychoanalyze your players, but you do need to realize that a player who is bringing his emotional baggage into the game is going to cause a bias. I've had players who have lost loved ones or had a bad breakup or just a myriad of things, and when they bring that to the table, they deprive themselves of the catharsis that getting out of their own head would be, and instead they're replacing it with the animosity they're already feeling and then exposing all of the other players to it. And so it really, really bugs me when people do that because they are harming the games group, they're harming the story as we're developing it, and they're harming themselves because they're not facing and acknowledging that part that is their real life angst, and instead they're trying to transfer it into the game, and that does no good for the game and certainly does nothing for them. So I'm going to get off my soapbox, but the point here is that if you bring the real into the fantasy and I get wind of it, we're going to stop the game and we're going to handle it, because I can't afford to have my players collectively have a bad time because you yourself are having a bad time. We need to dissociate the one from the other so that you can have a good time, get some catharsis and release from the tensions that you're having, but not in a way that harms the story, okay? So as we conclude the broadcast today, I do want to mention that I'm also doing a Session Zero Chronicles at 9 p.m. Pacific time every night to give an overview of a segment of the world of Nykos, the fictional setting that I run games in. There simply is too much for me to download into my players' minds to make that useful. And so by creating Session Zero Chronicles, we're going to have weekly updates on all the different species and nations and ideologies that are loose in the world of Nykos, so that the players can kind of get a better handle on who they are in the story and what their purpose is being there. It also will help with my actual session zeros because a lot of that information will be available and they can specifically download the pieces that make most sense to their character and their story. So we have already dealt with the Anandaran elves and with the Grund, and that's only 2 out of 35 species. So we've got a long way to go to cover all the different locales in the world of Nykos. So I hope to have you join us. That's 9 p.m. Pacific time on twitch.tv/NycosRPG. I want to thank you again for your being here, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you get updated whenever new content comes out. And also, if you like this video, share it with your friends so that we get better exposure, because the reality is I want to make everybody's game table more enjoyable and therefore expand the number of people that play role-play games in general. I'm Jonathan Albin, and I approve this message. Talk to you next time.